and the Salk across the street, and all of the other institutions that are around here, they made us welcome, and we didn't quite appreciate what a hotbed this place was for neuroscience. So, once again, we were lucky.
Had you known Francis Crick at this point? Had you met Francis?
There was a meeting at Johns Hopkins, and I had known of Vernon Mountcastle, and it was sort of in honor of Vernon Mountcastle. And Francis was there to give a talk. I happened to be there also, Dan Dennett, and somebody else. And so that was where I met Francis, and that was our last year. Excuse me. That was our last year at the University of Manitoba. And so it was a tremendous delight to meet Francis, and he was very surprised at the take that I had on problems such as the nature of consciousness, which was essentially, let's figure out how it works in the brain. The other really great thing that happened at that time was that Terry was at Johns Hopkins, Terry Sainosky. And he had just published an article with Jeff Hinton and Dana Ballard in Nature on computation with neurons. And so I was very interested to meet him. So I met both Terry and Francis at this particular meeting at Hopkins. And then, of course, suddenly things began to change, and we were flown out to give job talks here, and then we moved.
Which year was it?
That was 1984. So it was in the fall of 1983 that all of this excitement happened at Hopkins.
Okay, and so neurophilosophy was published in 1986.
That was 1980. So it was underway, but not yet completed. I had a lot of it sort of in place the year that we spent at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. And then we came back for a year, and then we came here. But it required an awful lot of work.
And you had written, were you writing Matter and Consciousness?
I finished Matter and Consciousness the fall quarter of our year at the Princetute, as they call it. That was fortunate too. We got to know the East Coast neuroscientists and psychologists, George Miller and Rodolfo Linos up at NYU.
And Mike Gazzaniga, of course.
That's right.
Because we were close enough to New York that I could go and see Mike and see Rodolfo, and it was good.
One of the reasons that I'm going through this trajectory is to make the point to people that science is this enormous networks of and that the interdisciplinary way in which it's going now is a wonderful development in my view, from these isolated silos that you were originally talking about, certainly with the...
Thank you for highlighting that, because Francis, we know, Francis Crick was a structural chemist. Well, originally he was a physicist. Terry Sainosky was a physicist who came into neuroscience. I think he did his... that's right, he was studying under Wheeler.
John Wheeler.
And then he shifted to do work with Hopfield on neural nets.
That's right.
Yeah.
And Pat and I came out of philosophy, and other people came out of computer science. It was very much an interdisciplinary gathering, and the cross-fertilization of disciplines was absolutely vital. None of this would have happened if those 7 or 8 disciplines hadn't started talking to one another.
But to bring this into philosophy as well, I mean, I mentioned to you the other day the Dobzhansky quote that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of natural selection. Of evolution.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It almost seems bizarre at this point that anybody could conceivably think that anything in philosophy could make sense unless you knew some neuroscience and some evolutionary biology. And yet
that is not the mainstream. The mainstream still really is quite isolated from the empirical sciences of any kind. The mainstream questions in epistemology about the nature of knowledge and how it's possible for us to know about the external world or to know about each other, that is really quite isolated from anything in psychology and anything in neuroscience. And our work is I think it's really quite fair to say, is regarded within the field of philosophy as very fringy, probably cranky, and certainly not of very much genuine philosophical interest.
There are reasons for this. Let me interject, Pat. We get arguments. It isn't just crankiness on their part. They think they have principled arguments, and one of the arguments is with regard to, say, epistemology, the theory of knowledge. What is it to be rational, or in moral theory, what is it to be just or fair? They say these are normative questions, and
by normative
meaning they're questions of what should be the case or what ought to be the case, not questions of what is the case. Now, they're quite willing to concede that the sciences deal with what is the case, but there's this dubious principle in philosophy over the last 100 years that you can't derive an ought from an is without an additional premise about an ought. So the suggestion is that normative knowledge somehow has a different foundation, a different source, and philosophers can pursue that. Now, there's a rational explanation, a principled reason, at least that's how they see it, for saying, look, it's all very well, you guys want to go off and learn about the brain, that's perfectly good, but don't think it's going to have anything essential to do with philosophy. Now, I think the counter to this view is easily seen once you consider an analogous case that the human race has already been through. Go back 400 or 500 years and ask what it is to be a living thing. Here we're dealing with very, very early biology. Well, what were the standard theories at the time? There were 3 or 4, but they were all of them versions of a living thing is alive because it is ensouled by a vital spirit. And biology and chemistry were still in their utter infancy, so this sort of a view held sway. Now, there could become further questions. What is it for a living thing to live a good life? Well, it's for it to be healthy. And people could say whether or not something is healthy and what health consists in is a normative question. It's a question of how the living thing should be or how it ought to conduct its internal affairs. And here, all of a sudden, you've got a principled argument for not doing physiology, for doing chemistry, for doing physics of the body. Now, we know, 500 years later, that coming to understand that the heart pumped the blood, coming to understand the thermodynamics of metabolism, the physiology and chemistry of cells, coming to understand all of this factual knowledge has given us a fantastically deeper insight into the normative question, what is it for a living thing to be healthy? And with that knowledge comes the technology to make people healthy when they get sick, to prevent smallpox beforehand, to get a grip on the moral domain so we can be far more successful at bringing about what ought to be the case. Now, I take that lesson from history as a lesson that is applicable here. We need to know what the brain is. We need to know how it functions, what it does when it learns, what it does when it theorizes, what it does when it engages in social behavior to evaluate theories. And this factual enterprise is going to end up giving us much deeper insight into all of these normative issues.
Hence what I call neuroproliferation. We have neuroethics now, we have neuroeconomics, we have neurojurisprudence.
Well done.
So the injection of interesting information from neuroscience, from fMRI, from single-cell studies and so on, into why people make decisions, into prediction, reward systems, into the way in which people assign values to things, into the way in which they make moral judgments. There's a book here called Neuroethics, of course, which you have a chapter in. It seems to me that this can only be a profitable enterprise at this point, right?
I think so. I mean, after all, the things that we really do want to understand have both a theoretical and a very practical dimension. I mean, it's worth remembering that 1% of the population is schizophrenic. And of course, we know that once you're 65, the probability of Alzheimer's goes way up. And everybody either has in their family or knows somebody very well who has a neurological issue of some kind, whether it's addiction or autism or alcoholism, or they are frontal or they dyslexic. And